Welcome back to our channel WhatsUpDebz, where we break down the latest news and trends shaping our world. Trucks crossing the US-Canada border through BC to Alaska could be facing extra fees in the future. While Premier David Eby has mentioned the idea before, this time he's taking serious action. The province will be tabling a new law that allows the government to take strong countermeasures in response to US tariffs. When President Donald Trump decided to impose tariffs on Canada, he likely expected some resistance. Maybe a few sharp words from Canadian leaders, and the usual diplomatic negotiations. What he probably didn't anticipate was Canada hitting back with a move that could directly impact US access to Alaska, and the usual diplomatic negotiations. Canada isn't just issuing strong words in response to US tariffs, it's taking action. One of the most significant retaliatory measures being discussed involves restricting key transportation routes to and from Alaska. This isn't just about trade numbers and tax percentages. This is about geography, logistics, and a relationship between two neighboring countries that suddenly feels a lot more fragile. To understand why this situation is such a big deal, it helps to look at Alaska itself. It's the largest US state, covering over 663,000 square miles of rugged terrain. It's a place of extreme landscapes, from towering mountains to vast glaciers and remote wilderness. But what makes it unique in this context is how physically separated it is from the rest of the country. Unlike the other 48 contiguous states, Alaska doesn't share a land border with the US. Its only direct neighbor is Canada. That geographical reality means that, for decades, Canada has played a crucial role in ensuring that Alaska remains connected to the rest of the United States. Every road trip from Alaska to the mainland US has to pass through Canada. The same goes for most railroads. Even air travel isn't exempt from this dependence. While direct flights exist between major Alaskan and US cities, the vast majority of air traffic between Alaska and the lower 48 crosses through Canadian airspace. With that in mind, it's not difficult to see why Canada has an enormous amount of leverage in this situation. If it wanted to, it could make travel to and from Alaska significantly more difficult for Americans. And now, in response to Trump-era tariffs that have been reignited by US trade policies, that possibility is inching closer to reality. Canada's economic response to these tariffs has been swift. When the US slapped import taxes on a wide range of Canadian goods, Canada retaliated with its own tariffs on American products, hitting industries in ways that would be immediately felt. These counter-tariffs targeted nearly $30 billion worth of US exports, including household essentials like orange juice, peanut butter, and various appliances. This wasn't just symbolic. It was a calculated move meant to pressure the US into reconsidering its trade approach. But what's unfolding now goes beyond tariffs. Canada is signaling that it's willing to use something even more disruptive: control over the transportation routes that keep Alaska connected. The province of British Columbia, which sits between Alaska and the rest of Canada, is at the center of this effort. Its officials have proposed new tolls on commercial trucks traveling between the lower 48 and Alaska, which could add considerable costs to American businesses relying on this supply chain. While tolls on highways and bridges aren't unusual, the fact that this measure is directly linked to a trade dispute makes it a clear warning shot. The underlying message from Canadian officials is that if the US keeps making it more expensive for Canadian goods to reach American markets, Canada will make it more expensive for American goods to reach Alaska. British Columbia's Premier, David Eby, has been vocal about this issue, making it clear that Canada isn't just going to absorb the economic hit without pushing back. His stance has been echoed by other Canadian leaders, who are increasingly frustrated by what they see as unfair US trade policies. Beyond the economic implications, there's a legal aspect to this situation that could complicate matters further. Canada and the US have long-standing agreements that govern travel and trade between Alaska and the mainland US. One of the most important is the treaty concerning the Alaska Highway, which was built during World War II as a strategic military route and later became the main overland connection for residents, businesses, and tourists. This treaty explicitly states that Canada cannot impose tolls on the highway when it is being used for the transport of goods between the US and Alaska. If British Columbia follows through with its toll plan, it could potentially violate this agreement, leading to a diplomatic dispute that extends beyond economic penalties. It would also raise questions about how the US might respond. whether through its own legal challenges, counter-tariffs, or even broader economic pressure on Canada. For now, the proposed tolls haven't been put into place yet, but they serve as a strong indicator of Canada's willingness to take more aggressive steps if the trade war escalates. Some experts believe that these measures are more about sending a message than actually implementing long-term policies. Others argue that Canada is simply preparing itself for the possibility that tensions with the US could continue to rise, especially if new tariffs are introduced in the coming months. What's clear is that the economic relationship between the US and Canada is entering a more unpredictable phase. While the two countries have always had disagreements over trade, the current situation is unusual because it directly affects American access to an entire US state. Alaskans, in particular, have been watching this situation closely. Many residents rely on goods transported via Canada, from fresh produce to essential fuel supplies. Any disruption in that flow could lead to shortages and price increases. Local leaders have expressed concern over the potential impact of Canadian retaliation, warning that it could hit Alaska harder than any other part of the US. Some state officials have already started pushing for federal intervention, hoping to resolve the dispute before it escalates any further. While Canada's response to US tariffs has been widespread, the province of British Columbia has taken center stage in what is quickly becoming a high-stakes standoff. The proposed tolls on commercial trucks traveling between the lower 48 and Alaska have become one of the most controversial retaliatory measures in this ongoing trade dispute. Unlike broad tariff increases, which affect entire industries, these tolls target a specific transportation route that is vital to keeping Alaska connected to the rest of the United States. British Columbia plays a unique role in this trade dispute because of its geography. The province's northern border runs alongside Alaska, making it the primary gateway for goods moving by land between the two. Without British Columbia's highways, rail networks and port access, Alaska would be almost completely cut off from overland transportation. The province essentially acts as a bridge between the lower 48 and America's northernmost state, a position that gives it considerable influence in this situation. Premier David Eby has been vocal about British Columbia's willingness to push back against US tariffs, and the proposed tolls are one of the clearest examples of that stance. While tolls on commercial vehicles are nothing new in North America, the reasoning behind this specific measure is what makes it different. Eby and other provincial officials have framed it as a direct response to the US decision to impose tariffs on Canadian goods, arguing that if the US government is going to raise the cost of trade for Canada, Canada has every right to raise the cost of trade for the US. The proposed tolls would apply to commercial trucks using key highways that pass through British Columbia on their way to Alaska. The details of the plan are still being discussed, but the basic idea is that American trucking companies would be required to pay a fee for using these roads, adding to the cost of shipping goods between the lower 48 and Alaska. The exact toll rates have not yet been determined, but industry experts estimate that they could significantly increase transportation costs for businesses that rely on this route. This has raised concerns among trucking associations and business owners who fear that the added costs will ultimately be passed on to consumers. Alaska is already one of the most expensive states in the US due to its remote location and reliance on imported goods. Higher shipping costs could drive up prices on everyday essentials, from groceries to construction materials, putting additional strain on residents and businesses. Eby has made it clear that the tolls are meant to send a message rather than just generate revenue. He has emphasized that British Columbia is prepared to stand up for its economic interests and will not allow American trade policies to go unchallenged. By targeting a critical transportation link, the province is effectively using its geography as leverage in the broader dispute between Canada and the US. However, the proposal is not without its legal and logistical challenges. One of the biggest obstacles is the Alaska Highway Treaty, a long-standing agreement between the US and Canada that governs the use of the highway system connecting Alaska to the mainland US. This treaty explicitly prohibits Canada from imposing tolls on certain portions of the route when used for transporting goods. The agreement was established to ensure smooth and uninterrupted travel along this vital corridor, and any attempt to introduce new fees could be seen as a violation. This legal barrier puts British Columbia in a difficult position. While the province has the authority to impose tolls on certain roads within its jurisdiction, it cannot simply override an international treaty. This means that if the tolls are implemented, they could quickly become the subject of diplomatic negotiations or even legal action. There are also logistical challenges to consider. Currently, there are no toll stations along the highways leading to Alaska, meaning that new infrastructure would need to be built to enforce the fees. Setting up toll booths, staffing them, and ensuring compliance with the new system would require significant investment. While modern electronic tolling systems could make the process more efficient, they would still take time to implement. Some officials within Canada, including leaders from other provinces, have raised concerns about the potential consequences of this move. The Premier of Yukon, Ranj Pillai, has acknowledged that implementing tolls would be a complex process and has suggested that careful legal review is needed before moving forward. While he supports Canada's right to defend its economic interests, he has also cautioned against taking actions that could further escalate tensions with the US. Not everyone agrees that the tolls would be difficult to enforce. Alaska State Senator Robert Myers, who is also a trucker, has pointed out that commercial trucks already have to stop at weigh stations for safety checks. He argues that adding toll booths at these locations wouldn't be a major logistical hurdle. However, he remains firmly opposed to the tolls, warning that they would significantly increase costs for businesses and consumers in Alaska. The trucking industry has also voiced strong opposition to the proposal. Jamie Benson, the executive director of the Alaska Trucking Association, has warned that the tolls could disrupt supply chains and make it more expensive to transport essential goods. She has urged policymakers to consider the impact on businesses and consumers before moving forward with any new fees. Beyond the economic and logistical concerns, there's also the question of how the US government might respond. While the Trump administration has not yet made an official statement on the proposed tolls, trade experts suggest that the US could challenge them through diplomatic channels or even take retaliatory action of its own. Given the already tense relationship between the two countries over tariffs, adding another layer of trade restrictions could further strain US-Canada relations. The broader question is whether these tolls are simply a warning shot or the first step toward a more aggressive stance from Canada. If they are implemented and prove effective in pressuring the US, other provinces could consider similar measures. This could lead to further disruptions in cross-border trade and transportation, creating additional economic uncertainty for businesses on both sides of the border. Some Canadian residents have even suggested going beyond tolls. In Yukon, local residents have proposed retaliatory measures, such as banning Alaska athletes from the upcoming Arctic Winter Games or prohibiting certain US citizens from entering Canada. While these ideas are largely symbolic, they highlight the growing frustration among Canadians who feel that their country is being unfairly targeted by US trade policies. Despite the controversy, Premier Eby has remained firm in his stance. He has stated that British Columbia will not tolerate ongoing threats and uncertainty from the US and that the province is prepared to take action if necessary. For now, the toll proposal remains in the discussion phase, but the message behind it is clear. Canada is willing to use its control over key transportation routes as leverage in the ongoing trade dispute. The most immediate and disruptive action Canada could take would be to block land access. Right now, the only way to drive between Alaska and the lower 48 is through Canada, specifically through British Columbia and the Yukon. The Alaska Highway, originally built during World War II as a military supply route, has since become a critical transportation link for Alaskan residents, businesses, and tourists. If Canada were to shut down or restrict access to this highway, it would create massive logistical challenges for anyone trying to move goods or travel between Alaska and the rest of the US. This kind of blockade would have serious consequences, particularly for small communities in Alaska that rely on supplies coming in by road. Many towns and cities, such as Haines and Skagway, are only accessible by road through Canada. Without that route, they would become even more isolated than they already are. Certain areas, like the town of Haida, depend entirely on Canadian infrastructure for access. Residents there would find themselves cut off from essential services if restrictions were put in place. But Canada doesn't even have to go as far as shutting down the entire highway. Simply imposing strict border controls, limiting transit permits, or introducing new inspection requirements could be enough to create significant delays and disruptions. Given that trucking is already one of the most expensive ways to transport goods to Alaska, adding new bureaucratic obstacles could drive costs up even further. Blocking land access isn't the only way Canada could make life difficult for Alaska. There's also the issue of marine transportation. The Inside Passage is one of the most important shipping routes for goods entering and leaving Alaska. This 500-mile stretch of protected water runs along the Pacific coastline and serves as a major artery for freight ships, ferries, and cruise liners. More than 90% of cargo headed for Alaska travels by sea, and a large portion of it passes through Canadian waters. If Canada wanted to turn up the pressure, it could introduce restrictions on certain types of cargo moving through its waters. This wouldn't necessarily mean shutting down the inside passage entirely, but even small changes, such as requiring new permits, increasing tariffs on U.S. cargo ships, or enforcing stricter environmental regulations could make it much more difficult and expensive to use this critical route. For Alaskans, the potential closure or restriction of the inside passage would have enormous consequences. The region's entire economy relies on maritime access, not just for cargo, but for tourism as well. The Alaska cruise industry is worth billions of dollars, bringing in over 1.65 million visitors in 2023 alone. Many of these cruise ships travel through Canadian waters, often stopping in ports like Vancouver and Victoria before heading north. If Canada were to place new restrictions on this industry, it could deal a serious financial blow to Alaska's tourism sector. Another key maritime access point that Canada controls is the Prince Rupert Ferry Terminal. This terminal, located in British Columbia, is the southernmost stop for the Alaska Marine Highway System, a vital transportation network that connects Alaskan coastal communities with the rest of North America. If Canada were to close or restrict access to this terminal, it would make it much harder for Alaskans to travel south by ferry, forcing them to rely more heavily on air travel. While restricting land and sea access would be the most direct ways for Canada to exert pressure, airspace is another factor that shouldn't be overlooked. U.S. commercial and military flights between Alaska and the lower 48 frequently pass through Canadian airspace. If Canada were to deny these overflight rights, it would force airlines and cargo carriers to take longer and more expensive routes. For commercial airlines, the impact of such a move would mostly be financial. It would mean higher fuel costs, longer flight times, and potential scheduling disruptions. While direct flights between major Alaskan cities and the lower 48 would still be possible, they would become less efficient. The bigger concern, however, would be military flights. Alaska is home to some of the most strategically important U.S. military bases, including Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson and Eielson Air Force Base. These bases play a critical role in U.S. defense strategy, particularly in monitoring air activity in the Arctic and the Pacific. While it is unlikely that Canada would interfere with military flights, any disruption to U.S. overflight rights would create serious tensions between the two nations. Even if Canada chose not to restrict transportation, it still has another powerful tool at its disposal: trade. A significant portion of Alaska's goods pass through Canadian rail and freight networks before reaching their final destination. The Port of Vancouver is a major hub for goods traveling to and from Alaska, and the Canadian railway system is essential for moving these shipments. If Canada were to impose tariffs, introduce new customs regulations, or slow down freight operations, it could have a major impact on Alaskan businesses. Right now, trade between Alaska and Canada is worth over $1 billion per year. Alaska exports around $596 million worth of goods to Canada, while importing $753 million in return. This trade supports thousands of jobs on both sides of the border, from fishermen and loggers to truck drivers and dock workers. The reality is that any major disruption to this trade would hurt both countries. Canada relies on its economic relationship with the US just as much as the US relies on Canada. While blocking Alaska's supply routes would put pressure on American policymakers, it would also create problems for Canadian businesses that depend on cross-border trade. Even though some of these measures might seem extreme, frustration is building among Canadian leaders. Many feel that the US has taken its trade relationship with Canada for granted for too long. While a full blockade of Alaska remains unlikely, the fact that it's even being discussed shows just how serious this trade war has become. The big question now is how the US will respond. If the Trump administration or future US governments continue to push aggressive trade policies, Canada could take even stronger retaliatory measures. On the other hand, if the two countries are able to negotiate a new trade agreement, some of these tensions could ease. At the end of the day, the Alaska Highway, the Inside Passage, and Canadian airspace aren't just lines on a map. They represent decades of cooperation between two countries that have long depended on each other for trade and security. Disrupting these connections would have consequences that go far beyond just Alaska. It would affect businesses, supply chains, and economies across North America. Alaska, more than any other U.S. state, relies heavily on its economic and logistical ties with Canada. The trade relationship between the two is significant, with over $1 billion worth of goods exchanged every year. More than 20,000 jobs in Alaska are directly linked to trade with Canada, and another 4,350 Alaskans work for Canadian-owned businesses. These numbers aren't just statistics. They represent families who rely on this trade to pay their bills, put food on the table, and maintain their livelihoods. For truckers, especially those operating between the lower 48 and Alaska, the proposed tolls in British Columbia could be a game-changer. The cost of moving goods is already high, and any additional fees would ultimately be passed on to businesses and consumers. Trucking associations have warned that these tolls could increase the price of essential goods, making it more expensive for Alaskans to buy everything from groceries to building materials. Local business owners are also worried. Alaska's economy is already shaped by its remote location, with long supply chains and high shipping costs being a constant challenge. Many fear that if tensions between the US and Canada escalate further, it could lead to broader disruptions in trade. While larger corporations might be able to absorb the extra costs, smaller businesses would struggle to stay competitive. Beyond the economic impact, the dispute is also affecting public sentiment on both sides of the border. Many Canadians feel that the US has been unfair in its trade policies, and some have even suggested retaliatory measures that go beyond economic measures. In Yukon, for example, residents have proposed banning Alaska athletes from the upcoming Arctic Winter Games. Others have gone so far as to suggest banning Donald Trump Jr. from entering Canada, citing his history of hunting in the region. While these ideas may not become reality, they reflect the growing frustration among Canadians who see these tariffs as unjustified. Despite the mounting tensions, there are still opportunities for both countries to de-escalate the situation. Canadian leaders have made it clear that they prefer a diplomatic resolution, but they won't hesitate to take further action if necessary. The Trump administration, meanwhile, has not yet publicly addressed the proposed tolls in British Columbia, but trade experts suggest that negotiations between the two governments are ongoing behind the scenes. At this point, it's difficult to predict exactly how this dispute will unfold. The economic relationship between the US and Canada has always been complex, with periods of cooperation and conflict shaping their interactions over the years. What makes this situation unique is how directly it affects Alaska, a state that depends on Canadian infrastructure for transportation, trade, and connectivity. For the average person, whether in Alaska or Canada, the main concern isn't politics. It's the cost of living, job security, and access to essential goods and services. The idea of a full-scale blockade of Alaska remains unlikely, but even smaller disruptions to trade and transportation could have significant ripple effects. While policymakers in Washington and Ottawa debate tariffs and tolls, it's the everyday workers and families who will feel the real impact of these decisions. One thing is certain, Canada has made it clear that it will not sit back and accept economic losses without pushing back. Whether this leads to a resolution or a deeper trade war remains to be seen. But with both countries holding valuable leverage in this dispute, the stakes couldn't be higher. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and comment. Stay informed. Stay ahead, as it helps our channel's ratings. Until next time. Don't miss this next one, it's big.